This has to be one of the strangest cameras made by a big camera company, maybe ever. This is a real digital camera actually made by Sony that looks like a perfume bottle. And it isn't some cheapy camera either. There's some really high-end features in here. There's a 19 megapixel Sony Exmor R sensor in here that's larger than the Pentax Q even. There's some serious image making quality in this crazy looking camera. It's like falling over now. There we go. But the cool features don't stop there, and I'm going to show you all of them today in my new candidate for Sony's weirdest camera ever made. And that's saying something. Okay, so this camera came out in 2014, and amazingly, I have one here new in box, so we get to see this amazing box art. And if you're like me a few months ago, where I discovered this camera for the first time and I thought, why have I never seen this thing before? That's because this was an Asia exclusive camera that never released to Europe or the United States. It was Asia exclusive. A big thank you has to go out to my friend and channel supporter, I'll link his channel in the description, from Hong Kong, who picked up this camera and some other Asia exclusive cameras that I'm really excited to check out. Thank you for finding this, because if I were to buy this in the United States, it's very expensive. You saved me literally hundreds of dollars. It's called the Sony KW1, by the way, and it came in 4 different colors: white, peach, green, and purple. Each came with this decorative ring attachment thing that serves as both a handle, but also a little selfie stand. And yeah, the whole thing looks like a perfume bottle, from the shaping to this top piece with the lens, which is clear and a little bedazzled. And as the sticker informs us, apparently this was made in part by this company called, I'm gonna butcher this, Swarovski, which makes jewelry and $100 phone cases. And that's one of the most obscure camera collaborations I've ever seen. This lens section up top rotates 180 degrees to let you shoot selfies or normal shots, something that some smartphones played with before just deciding it was easier to give you multiple cameras and lenses, I guess. On the side, there's a power button and a shutter button, which has a 2-stage shutter button for pre-focusing. On the other side is a micro SD card slot, something your phone doesn't have anymore. And we will be comparing this a little bit to a phone, because I think that was its primary target audience back before smartphones just completely obliterated this market. On the bottom, there's a tripod thread and a charging port. The battery can be removed and charged separately or charged in camera. And yes, this large 3.3-inch display is touchscreen, and you use it to control everything on the camera. So yeah, it's really close in form factor to a smartphone. So what are some of the premium features that make it stand out? I mentioned this is really just a mid-range, higher-end point and shoot in disguise as like a toy. And all of that starts with the lens. This is a 21mm equivalent f2 prime lens, no zoom here. And that's a focal length that is not common at all in dedicated point and shoot cameras, but way more common in smartphones. The quality of the lens seems really good, as you'll see more examples of later. And the large-ish sensor, for this type of camera, and that f2 aperture does allow you to get some bokeh on close-up subjects. As kind of cool as it is to get a prime 21mm lens, just because that's kind of uncommon in dedicated cameras, like I said, not smartphones. It's not my favorite everyday focal length. Everything just seems way too wide for me. But it makes sense that they would do this, because the primary use case of this camera seems to be selfies. If you look at their advertising, they're targeting a very specific demographic of people who are, I guess, just take pictures of themselves all day is what they're going after, and need a perfume bottle camera to do that. So 21mm in that respect, I guess, makes sense. Turning on the camera, you're greeted with some exciting sound effects that continue throughout using the camera, and thankfully can be turned off. Like I said, everything is controlled using the touchscreen, so you can adjust the image quality here to the max setting, although there is no RAW mode, unfortunately, which may seem obvious because it's kind of a toy-looking kind of camera, but is a shame because the sensor here is actually really powerful. You can toggle on and off this LED light on the back for selfies, and I was surprised how bright it is. It's as bright as my modern smartphone light, but maybe even brighter. You can shoot 1080p video with that continuous light on as well. So if you want to go all 2010s vlogging style with this camera, you absolutely can do that. Here's some sample of what that looks like. And actually, considering what they had back in 2014, this might have been kind of one of the better selfie video camera setups you could get for, this price bracket, minus the ability to add an external mic. But I mean, back then, you didn't have a ton of options. There are a few different shooting modes on the camera. There's a beauty effect, which retouches your skin, and you can adjust the intensity. Here it is up to the max, which is terrifying to look at. There's an intelligent auto, which is the basic shooting mode. There's a picture effect mode with some fun filter effects you can play with, although they all seem kind of terrible. And then there's a scene selection, which lets you choose from a variety of shooting settings for various scenarios, like taking pictures of food, landscape, or prioritizing higher shutter speeds or higher ISO. So basically it's all auto here with just a few things you can tweak here and there with no raw mode, which once again makes sense for the type of camera they were making, but just seems like a shame because you could probably get a lot out of this sensor. Now the image quality here is really good. You could definitely get away with using this camera today and no one would notice, especially online. Your modern smartphone can take pictures just as detailed, but layered with all that sort of like HDR computational photography nonsense, which you can turn off using apps. But you know, by default doesn't look super great to me at least. So these look more realistic and natural to me, even though they're coming from a similar size sensor and focal length. But depending on what smartphone you're using, this may actually produce more natural bokeh, might have a slightly larger sensor or slightly brighter aperture combination. But even with the image quality being good, there's just no point in my mind that you would use this over just using your smartphone because it's very similar shooting experience. And this camera doesn't have the argument of some other vintage point and shoot cameras where they have real flashes, which your phone doesn't. This one doesn't, it's an LED flash. What makes this camera especially special to me though, and it's kind of crazy to think about, is if this came out a year later, maybe even 6 months later, it wouldn't exist at all. And that's because right when this camera was being released in the 2014 era was when smartphones really asserted their dominance completely. And it was game over for fun point and shoot cameras like this. In fact, it kind of came out too late, and maybe that's why we don't see them anymore. They probably had it worked up a year or two prior, and then by the time they released, there's like, oh yeah, smartphones are better already. It was made as a social media selfie-taking camera better than smartphones at the time, right when smartphones were getting better anyway, and were way more convenient for sharing photos. You can pair with your phone with an app for Wi-Fi to download the photos and everything, but none of that really matters when the iPhone 6, which came out at the same time, it could do all that and like faster and better. And then you only had to buy one thing. So this camera is a relic from a time we will probably never get back, when camera manufacturers were just experimenting with all sorts of crazy designs to try to capture a market. I think this camera is super fun. It's surprisingly good and way more interesting than a smartphone. The only bad part today, it is prohibitively expensive and pretty hard to find. But wow, what a weird camera Sony made. Thumbs up if you want to see my other Asia exclusive digicams sometime sooner rather than later. And check out this other crazy Sony camera if you haven't already. Sony's done some weird stuff, turns out. And until next time, as always, happy snapping.